Welcome, I am Palantir Pointers, and in this video I will tell you the story of Aragorn, also called Estelle, Thorongil, Strider and Dunedain, 16th captain of the Dunedain of the North, heir of Isildur, Elessar, king of the unified kingdom of Gondor and Arnor and king of the West. Aragorn's parents were Arathorn and Gilran, who were both descended from the kings of Arthedain. In fact, Arathorn was the 15th captain of the Dunedain of the North, heir in the direct line of Arvedui, last king of Arthedain, who was married to Firiel, daughter of the king Ondoher of Gondor, so that in Aragorn the lines of Arnor and Gondor were united at the same time, being heir of Elendil, High King of Arnor and Gondor and son of Amandil, the last lord of Andúni, descendant of Elros, first king of Númenor and brother of Elrond. That is why Aragorn descended from practically all the important lineages of men and elves that had ever existed in Middle-earth. So Aragorn was born on March 1st, 2931 of the Third Age. His first 2 years were peaceful, but unfortunately in the year 2933, his father died, thanks to an arrow from an orc, and then his mother went to Rivendell to live there, with his son. At Rivendell, they were welcomed by Elrond, who loved Aragorn as if he were his own son, and acted as his father to him, but hid his real name and his true lineage, because he knew that Sauron was trying to find out if there was any heir left of Isildur. So Elrond gave her the name Estelle, which in Elvish means hope, and Estelle spent the next 18 years of her life living in Rivendell, learning a little of everything, from languages, history, and botany to the arts of war. But when Estelle was 20 years old, he returned to Rivendell after carrying out great deeds in the company of Elladan and Elrohir, and Elrond looked at him, feeling happy because he saw that he was noble and had reached maturity at an early age. So he called him, told him his real name, told him what his lineage was and of the 4 vital assets of his house. He gave him 2 of them, the ring of Barahir and the fragments of the Narsil sword. The other 2 he retained because I had to earn it. Upon learning what his true name and lineage were, Aragorn's heart rejoiced, and lo and behold, the next day he was walking through the forests, when suddenly he saw a maiden walking before him, beautiful, with dark hair, rubbing moved by a sudden breeze, with shining eyes. Aragorn called her as Beren had called Light a millennia ago. The lady turned to him and asked him who he was, and Aragorn told her her name. But as he did so, he felt that that little lineage had little meaning. Value it had now, because it was nothing compared to the dignity and beauty of the maiden. Then she reveals that they were both distant relatives, because she was Arwen Ondomiel, daughter of Elrond, and Aragorn falls in love with her. In the days that followed, he became silent, and his mother had noticed that something had happened, but when Aragorn told her, she could not dissuade him from abandoning that love. Simultaneously, Elrond saw many things and read in hearts. He understood that Aragorn was. He had fallen in love with his daughter, so he called him and told him that a great destiny awaited him, either to rise higher than all his ancestors since Elendil, or to fall into darkness with the rest of his lineage, and that in the long years of fatigue and pain that awaited him, he would never take a wife or associate with any woman until his time had come and he had proven himself worthy. In addition, Elrond prophesied that Arwen would go to Valinor unless Aragorn intervened and forced her to decide between a husband and a father, but that was still a long way off. So Aragorn said goodbye affectionately, said goodbye to his mother, Arwen, and Rivendell, and departed for the wilds. Among his first trips, we know that in 2956, Aragorn met Gandalf the Grey, with whom he began a great friendship. The following year, when Aragorn was 26 years old, he began his great travels and wanderings that lasted 23 years in total. First, he went to the kingdom of Rohan, where he joined the ranks of King Thengel, and after serving there as a warrior, he travelled to the south, entered Gondor, and became a great captain of Minas Tirith. Then Ecthelion, father of Denethor and grandfather of Boromir and Faramir. He was the Seneschal of Gondor, and there Aragorn never used his true name, but disguised himself, and was known by everyone as Thorongil, the Star Eagle, because he was fast, had sharp eyesight and wore a silver star on his mantle, but no one knowed his real name, nor did he know the land in which he was born. Denethor, son of Ecthelion, was as similar to Thorongil as the closest of his relatives, and yet Denethor was second in esteem, both in men and in his father. For Ecthelion loved the stranger more than his own son. However, he never competed with Denethor, nor gave himself a position higher than that of the Seneschal's servant, and both helped Ecthelion. In fact, the two always agreed on everything except in matters of magicians, since Thorongil warned Ecthelion not to trust him in Saruman the White and to prefer Gandalf the Grey, while Denethor advised the opposite. In that period, the rebels of Umbar had a force of great danger to Gondor and a threat to the fiefdoms of the south that could be deadly if Sauron presented open war. So Thorongil asked authorization from the Seneschal of Gondor, gathered a small fleet, and unexpectedly headed to a bar at night, where he set fire to a large part of the Corsairs' ships. He defeated the port captain in battle on the docks, and then retreated, his fleet with very few losses. Thanks to that feat, Thorongil would have been received in Minas Tirith with great honours. But when he returned to Pelargir, to the sorrow and amazement of all, he did not return to the capital, but instead sent a farewell message to Ecthelion, took a boat, crossed the Anduin, said goodbye to his companions, and continued alone towards the Mountains of Shadow. We know that from the Mountains of Shadow he travelled through the distant lands of Rhûn, the unexplored east of Middle-earth, and then towards Harad, until he even reached the southern hemisphere of the world, where the stars seemed strange to him, since he was used to seeing them from the north hemisphere. In both lands, he sought to explore the hearts of men, both evil and good, and to unmask the plots and stratagems of Sauron's stags. Finally, he returned to the northwest at some point. He entered Moria through the East Gate and continued making numerous dangerous journeys, some of which were with Gandalf, who learned a lot of wisdom. The years became long and difficult. He crossed many mountains and rivers. He traversed many plains until the leagues from Rivendell to Gondor were but a small part in the account of all his travels. But his home was in the north. If he had a home, his heart was in Rivendell, a place to which he returned whenever he could, although his destiny was not to live in peace even there, in the beautiful house of Elrond. For almost 30 years, Aragorn dedicated himself to the cause against Sauron. The undertakings he undertook were long and hard, until he became the most intrepid of all the men of his time, skilled in the arts and more versed in the traditions than any of them, because he had elven wisdom. In his eyes, he carried a light that when turned on, few were able to endure. His face was sad and severe because of the fate that weighed on him, but he always kept hope alive in the depths of his heart, from which joy sometimes flowed like a rock spring. In the books, it is physically described that over time he had acquired a sullen and severe appearance that rarely smiled. He had shaggy black hair with grey strands, discerning grey eyes in a pale, severe and lean face, with a tall and thin body. He used to travel assuming the most diverse appearances, being known in Eriador as a weather-beaten man, who wore soft leather boots that reached well but had been well worn and covered in mud, a heavy olive-green cloak stained for many trips that wrapped around his body, and he used to wear a hood that shadowed his face. He always walked with great strides, with long strides, and that is why in that region he was known as Trankos. He had the habit of smoking whenever he was stopped, such as when he stopped on the road and stood guard at night, and in fact he had a pineapple, long, curiously sculpted. On his weapons, he used to carry the broken fragments of Narsil with him at all times. As Tolkien explains in letter 210, Aragorn did not fight with a sword because his sword was broken. In Amon Sul, for example, in the books, Aragorn does not confront the Nazgûl with his sword as in the film, but drives them away with 2 torches. Aragorn became the greatest traveller and hunter of his time. He travelled so many times in all the senses in all the lands that were in the region and in the cloudy mountains, that he knew absolutely all the places and regions. He had a fine ear, and although he could not become invisible, he had followed the tracks of many wild and cautious creatures and commonly avoided being seen if he wanted it that way. He also knew how to read signs, interpret tracks, and had skills as a hunter. The men of Bree knew that he was a ranger and took him for someone who came and went, who spoke rarely, although he knew how to tell a great story when he felt like it. As he was always disguised, few knew what his true identity was. But when he showed his true lineage, men considered him worthy of honor despite his crude appearances like a king in exile. So, at last, when after 23 years Aragorn finished his great journeys and returned from the dangers in the dark confines of Mordor, where Sauron now dwelt again dedicated to evil, he was very tired and wanted to rest in Rivendell before undertaking new journeys, and arrived for the first time in his life at the borders of Lorien, where he was admitted by the Lady Galadriel. Aragorn did not know it, but Arwen was also there. She had barely changed because the years had not touched her, but she had a graver face and was rarely heard to laugh. Then Galadriel, who was Arwen's grandmother, begged Aragorn to take off his shabby traveller's clothes and dressed him in silver and white with an elven grey cloak and a shining gem on his forehead, making him more like an elven lord than a god. Mortal man, having reached full maturity of body and mind, Arwen saw him again after the long separation, and as he advanced towards her under the trees of Caras Galadhon, laden with golden flowers, the maiden made her choice, and his fate was sealed. At that time, Aragorn was 49 years old, while Arwen was 27-39. For a season they walked together through the glades of Lothlorien, until on the night of the summer solstice they went to Serin Amroth, the heart of the kingdom, and swore eternal fidelity to each other. They were happy, and Aragorn gave Arwen the ring of Barahir that she would guard for the rest of her life. Then Aragorn left Lorien and returned to Rivendell, but there, when Elrond learned of his daughter's choice, he told Aragorn that although he loved her, he would not allow her to marry him and renounce the life of the elves, unless, if he became king of Gondor and Arnor at the same time. Neither of them spoke of the matter again, and Aragorn set out once again to face danger and fatigue. About Gilran, her mother, the truth is that after a few years she said goodbye to Elrond and returned to Eriador with her own people where she lived alone. Then, from then on, Aragorn and she saw each other on rare occasions, as he spent long years in distant countries. But in the year 3007, when Aragorn returned to the north, Gilran foresaw that this was their last separation. Her son tried to comfort her with words of hope, but he couldn't change anything, and I ended up leaving with a heavy heart, while she died before the following spring. Thus orphaned by both parents, without being able to be with his beloved, and forced to live a wandering life, Aragorn continued from one place to another without ever resting, always busy, leading the Rangers of the North for another 20 years, until the wizard Gandalf later asked him for help. Of the strange behaviour that the hobbit Bilbo had shown at his birthday party, and noticed that all kinds of spies were gathering around his land. Because of this, Aragorn had his men, the Dunedain of the North, double the guard they were doing in the region. Gandalf also told him that he feared that Bilbo's ring was Sauron's only ring, and Aragorn advised hunting down Gollum, the previous owner of Bilbo's ring, and as it seemed fair that Isildur's heir, by not destroying the only ring, decided to accompany him. Wizard in the long and desperate chase, together the two friends explored the harsh lands from end to end for 8 years, from the valleys of Anduin, Mirkwood, and Rhovanion, until reaching the very mountains of Shadow and the confines of Mordor, and rumours reached them of Gollum, and they assumed that he had lived in the Dark Hills for a long time, but they never found him. Gandalf ended up despairing and went to Gondor to see if he could find evidence, while Aragorn remained in Mordor looking for Gollum. However, in the year 3017, he also finally despaired and set out on his way back, but fortune helped him when he was already returning, and he stumbled upon what he was looking for. The footprints of soft feet on the banks of a muddy pond. Those footprints, they were fresh with quick steps, and they were not going towards Mordor but away. so Aragorn followed her through the swamps of the dead until he reached him next to a lagoon. There she pounced on him. They both struggled. Gollum bit him and Aragorn hit him, but in the end, he was able to capture him. Then began the worst part of the journey, which was the way back. In the hope that none of Sauron's spies would notice, Aragorn took Gollum through the northern end of Emyn Muil and crossed the Anduin just above Sarn Gabir. Heaps of logs were often thrown there from the eastern bank, and tying Gollum to a log, he swam across the river with him, and then continued his march north along paths as far west as he could find them along, from the Fangan Reach until you crossed the Limclaro, then the Nimrodel and the Silver River through the forest of Lorien. Continue forward, avoiding Moria and the valley of Imril, and cross the Gladio until you arrive near the Chariot. There he crossed the Anduin again, with the help of the Beornids, and entered the Black Forest where he handed over his prisoner to the elves of King Thranduil. The entire journey on foot was approximately 900 miles, which would be almost 1,500 kilometers that Aragorn covered. With fatigue, with only 50 days in which he watched Gollum both day and night, forcing him to walk in front of him with a rope around his gagged neck until the lack of water and food softened him a little. After that, Aragorn went to Eriador, and Gandalf told him that he would go talk to Frodo to alert them about the ring and send him away from the region. They met for the last time on May 1st, 3018 at the Ford of Sarn, at which time Gandalf told him that everything had gone well with Frodo and that he would leave for Rivendell the last week of September. Knowing then that the wizard was at his side, Aragorn went on a trip to attend to his own affairs, but that was a mistake, because Gandalf received news that made him leave the region and abandon Frodo, and Aragorn was not around to help. Thus, when he returned in September, Gildor Inglorian's elves told him that the wizard had disappeared, and they had seen the Nazgul, and that Frodo was no longer in his house. Cursing himself for leaving, Aragorn then watched the Eastern Road impatiently for days, awaiting Frodo's arrival, until he was finally able to find him and his fellow hobbits when they arrived from the Barrow Gullies with Tom Bombadil. While hiding, Aragorn heard that Frodo's last name was Baggins, but he wanted his companions to call him Sotomonte in front of other people. This made him assume their identity, so he followed them to Bree, slipped over the village fence and reached the pony, Stomper right behind them. Since Aragorn did not know that Gandalf had left a message for Frodo, he had to try to gain his trust with his own methods, although the first thing would be to study them well to know if he was the real Frodo, or if it was a trap that Sauron was setting for him. Therefore, when the hobbits were in the common room of the inn, he invited Frodo to sit with him, and warned him that Pippin was talking too much, which resulted in Frodo starting to attract Pippin's attention. The others, singing and dancing until they made the mistake of accidentally putting on the ring and disappearing in front of everyone. Aragorn was the only one who remained impassive when that happened, and when Frodo returned, he asked him to have a private talk. He accosted Frodo when he was returning to his parlour and was convincing him to be his companion, and when the innkeeper Butterbur delivered Gandalf's letter that proved that Aragorn was an ally, just as he claimed to be. Thanks to that, he immediately gained Frodo's trust, and he advised sleeping there that night and leaving the next day in the direction of Rivendell. Thus, the four hobbits set out with Aragorn from Bree towards the east, on a journey that lasted 20 days, in which everyone came to appreciate seeing the Ranger, although he was strange and grim, which made him look like Gandalf, was thanks to he believed that the hobbits were able to escape from the Nazgul and reach Rivendell safely, because he guided them all along the way, always looking for the paths that he believed were best or most suitable for each moment and adapting to the needs in each section. However, he made a mistake, because since no one knew anything about Gandalf, Aragorn was eager to discover news about him, which led him to Weathertop to look for some sign of the wizard, and because of that, the Nazgul detected them. And although Aragorn managed to make them rise with fire, the Lord of the Nazgul wounded Frodo in the shoulder. Aragorn found Athelas and healed him as best he could, although the hobbit was about to die, and it was thanks to the fortuitous arrival of Glorfindel, who met them on the way, who managed to complete the last leg of the journey and flee from the Nazgul at the Bruinen River. Already in Rivendell, he was healed by Elrond. Although Aragorn did not attend the recovery feast because Elladan and Elrohir had returned unexpectedly from the harsh lands and brought news that he wanted to hear immediately. It was then seen that he was a good friend of Bilbo, whom he helped with the songs that the Hobbit composed, and that Bilbo, like most of the inhabitants of Rivendell, referred to Aragorn by the name of the Dunedain. When Frodo left the party, he saw that Aragorn was standing next to Arwen, with whom he was speaking in a low voice, that he was wearing the dark cloak that seemed to be dressed in the chainmail of the elves, and that a star was shining in his chest. This would be the only scene that Aragorn and Arwen have throughout the entire narrative of The Lord of the Rings, until after their wedding in The Return of the King. The next day, Aragorn attended the Council of Elrond, where he was once again wrapped in those worn travelling clothes. During the long meeting, the story of the One Ring was discussed, and it was decided that Frodo had to take it to Mount Doom to destroy it. But regardless of what happened with the ring, Aragorn determined that the time had finally come to return to Gondor and make himself known. That was due to the arrival of Boromir, who told the prophetic dream that he and Faramir had shared, and Aragorn took the words of that dream as a command that obliged him to go to Minas Tirith. Therefore, he decided that the sword Narsil would be forged again and would travel to Minas Tirith to provide all possible help in the war against Sauron. However, before leaving, when the council ended, Aragorn went with the explorers of Rivendell to seek news of the Nazgul, where they found a torn cloak and 8 drowned black horses that made them think that the 9 helpless riders had returned to Mordor. After that, Elrond chose him as one of the 9 members of the Company of the Ring, although Aragorn's intention was not to accompany Frodo to the end, since that would be Gandalf's task. But he planned to separate and go to Minas Tirith with Boromir. But since in both cases the road went south for many leagues, he decided that they would all leave together. The fragments of Narsil were forged again into a sword that Aragorn called Andúril, Flame of the West. And for many days he studied with Gandalf the maps and books that were in Rivendell to try to trace the best possible path to his objective. When they finally left, it is specified that Aragorn carried the sword Andúril and no other weapon, neither daggers, nor bows, nor arrows, and that he was dressed in green and mouldy brown clothes, like a desert horseman. During the first part of the journey, they advanced only at night to avoid anyone seeing them, and Aragorn led the company with Gandalf, as he knew that region well, even in the dark. However, the 2 friends disagreed about how they should cross the Misty Mountains, because Gandalf defended that they should go through Moria, while Aragorn did not want to hear about it and offered the crossing of the Caradhras as a solution. In the end, he managed to convince the wizard, but when they reached the mountain, they were engulfed by snow and an astonishing storm, which, without a doubt, would have killed the hobbits if it had continued. So they had no choice but to retreat, and Aragorn and Boromir were in charge of opening a path in the snow and carrying the hobbits on their backs until they returned safely to the foot of the mountain. Having failed in their attempt to cross the mountains, the company was forced to go through Moria, although Aragorn did not wish to enter there again, for he had a sinister memory of the first time. Before arriving, they were harassed by wolves who attacked them until they had no choice but to enter the mines, and when they arrived in front of the door, the Guardian of the Water closed their access, so that they were trapped inside and had no choice to continue forward to come out the other side. For 3 days, they walked through Moria, where Aragorn closed the rear of the company gravely and silently, until on the 3rd day they reached the chamber of Mazarbul, where they were ambushed by the orcs, Aragorn and Boromir being the ones who killed the most enemies, and Aragorn taking charge in person to kill the chief of the orcs who wounded Frodo. He carried the hobbit, believing him dead, but it turned out that the mithril mail had saved him, so they all ran together until they reached the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and there Gandalf stayed behind to cover them, although Aragorn did not want to leave him alone. So the ranger decided to help him against the Balrog, but it was too late, because Gandalf fell into the abyss before he reached his side. Thus, assuming leadership in that moment of horror, Aragorn returned forward and led the company to the eastern gates. killed the orc captain who was guarding them and went outside. From there, he took them without delay to Lorien, although they stopped for a moment to rest and healed Frodo and Sam's wounds as well as he could. Then in the forest, Haldir recognized his name and revealed that Aragorn had the protection of the Lady Galadriel, while Legolas introduced him to the other elves as a friend of the elves. So it was that Aragorn entered Lorien for the second and last time in his life, where he again passed through the hill of Serin Amroth, the same place where he had promised himself to Arwen 38 years before, the place he loved most in Middle-earth, and then the company was brought before Galadriel, Aragorn and Legolas, being the only ones who could raise their gaze. The 8 friends remained there for 1 month in which they rested and rested, although Aragorn was a sea of doubts, because his idea when leaving Rivendell had been to accompany Boromir to Minas Tirith and help in the War of Gondor, since he believed that the message of the dream was a command and that the hour had finally arrived when the Heir of Isildur would appear to fight against Sauron's dominion. But in Moria, he had had to take up Gandalf's burden, and he knew that now he could not leave aside to Frodo, in case the Hobbit wanted to travel directly to Mount Doom without first passing through Minas Tirith. When they met with Galadriel and Celeborn before they left, Aragorn was presented with a scabbard that they had made especially for Anduril, and which was adorned with flowers and leaves, woven together with gold and silver, and with numerous gems arranged like elven runes that read the name and lineage of the sword. In addition, the lady asked him if there was anything else he would want from her, and Aragorn responded that she knew well all his desires, and that for a long time she had kept the only treasure he was looking for, referring to Arwen. Therefore, Galadriel gave him the Elessar, the green elven stone, which from then on Aragorn wore on his chest, mounted on a silver brooch, which imitated an eagle. After that, they finally left Lorien, still not knowing which path the company would follow, but instead sailed south in 3 boats. Aragorn drove Frodo and Sam's car, and spent the trip debating with himself which would be the best route to complete the mission. During the trip, they were attacked by the orcs of the eastern shore, and by a winged Nazgul, but they managed to avoid them both and continue to Path Galen, where Aragorn decided that they should stop to make the final decision, whether to go to Mordor or Minas Tirith, and whether to divide, or continue all together, as no one seemed capable of making such a decision. Aragorn gave the responsibility to Frodo, who asked to have an hour alone to reflect. While Frodo wandered alone, Aragorn admitted that it was not advisable for everyone to go to Mordor, as it was a desperate risk for both 8 and 2, and said that in his opinion it would be best for Frodo, Sam, Gimli and himself to go to Mount Doom, while Legolas, Merry, Pippin and Boromir had to go to Minas Tirith. But then Boromir arrived, confessing that he had seen Frodo in the forest, putting on the ring, and dismayed, and believing that something could happen to his master. Sam made to run towards the forest, followed by everyone else, Aragorn trying in vain to stop them and put order. Helplessly, he ordered Boromir to look for and protect Merry and Pippin. While he set off after Sam, he caught up with him immediately thanks to his long strides and asked him to follow him to Amon Hen. But Sam, unable to keep up with his pace, he stopped. He was left behind, and without realizing it, Aragorn reached the top of Amon Hen when suddenly he heard Boromir's horn. He immediately rushed to his aid but arrived too late because Boromir had been mortally wounded. With his last breath, he told him that the halflings had been taken, that he had tried to take the ring from Frodo and asked him to go to Minas Tirith, to which Aragorn promised that Minas Tirith would not fall. So Boromir died with a smile on his face. Then Legolas and Gimli arrived, also attracted by the war horn, and without time or tools to give him a proper burial, they transported their friend's body to the shore, placed it in one of the boats, and left it in the hands of the Anduin River. Then Aragorn examined the footprints of the camp, and deduced that Frodo and Sam had left for the east. If they went after them, they would have to abandon Merry and Pippin to torment and death, so that he was finally able to make a decision. Destiny Frodo's power was no longer in his hands, so he would look for Merry and Pippin wherever he needed to, and Legolas and Gimli decided to go with him. For 4 days, the 3 hunters marched across the plains on foot, running or walking. Aragorn led them, constantly examining the terrain, both to follow the tracks and to detect if there had been any escape. But the orcs were gaining further and further distance, until that, in the end, they were more than 30 hours ahead. Legolas saw the Rohirrim of Éomer arrive, so Aragorn ordered to stop and wait for them. And from them, they learned that the orcs had been killed, that they knew nothing about the hobbits, and that Rohan was at war with Saruman. Fortunately, Éomer trusted their word and gave them 2 horses in exchange for them to return to Edoras. After investigating, return the horses and present themselves before the king. Then he left back to Edoras, while the 3 friends went to the battlefield. They spent the night, and the next day Aragorn discovered footprints of a hobbit. He traced them to Fangorn. He discovered footprints of the 2 hobbits, and when they reached the hill, in the one in which Merry and Pippin had found Barbol 2 days before, Gandalf the White appeared. In a summary way, he made them see that Merry and Pippin were fine. He explained to them what had happened to him in Moria, and that Saruman was a double traitor, and then they direct guide to Edoras. In the capital, they were able to visit King Theoden, but they were not well received due to the orders of Grima Wortongue. But they managed to convince Harma, the head of the royal guard, that Gandalf should enter with his staff, and thanks to this, he was able to heal the king. Restoring him to health, then Éomer was freed, Grima was discovered and fled to Isengard, and on Gandalf's advice, the king summoned the army to destroy Saruman's threat. It was also at that moment when Aragorn first saw Éowyn, the king's niece, young and beautiful, but he immediately understood from her looks and the way she trembled when giving him the farewell cup that she was attracted to him, so that Aragorn changed his face to that of change and without a smile. He prepared for battle by dressing in chainmail, helmet and shield, and finally they set out with more than 1,000 men towards the west. Their purpose was to go to the fords of Isen. Along the way, they met a messenger reporting that the fords had fallen and what remained of the men of the Westfold had retreated to Helm's Deep. Therefore, King Theoden's army detoured there, except for Gandalf, who left without saying where. The Rohirrim settled in the fortress of Hornville and fought for a whole night against Saruman's army in a long and hard battle in which Aragorn, with Éomer, was in charge of defending both the gate of the fortress and the wall of below. But the enemies seemed unstoppable. The defenders were divided, and at dawn, King Theoden decided to make a desperate cavalry charge, in which Aragorn accompanied him. And when doing so, Gandalf arrived with Erkenbrand and all the survivors of the Westfold, who they attacked Saruman's army from the flank, while the Yukons destroyed them from the rear, and King Theoden in the vanguard, thus winning the battle. On the advice of Gandalf, King Theoden, Aragorn and a small escort went straight to Isengard, where they found the enemy's fortress destroyed and taken by the Ents, with Merry and Pippin waiting for them. Aragorn enjoyed that meeting, and then witnessed with the others the discussion between Saruman and Gandalf, in which Gandalf dominated the wizard completely. However, because of Grima, Saruman lost an object from the tower, which ended up in the hands of Pippin, who at dusk wanted to take a look at it, and it was thus revealed that it was one of the Palantiri, the seeing stones that was in contact with the one that Sauron possessed of Minas Ithil. Because of this, Gandalf took Pippin with him to Minas Tirith, although before leaving, he gave Aragorn the Palantir, because as Heir of Isildur, he was the rightful owner of the stone. So, after Gandalf had left, King Theoden and his escort resumed their journey back to Helm's Deep, but they had barely crossed the fords of Isen when they heard the sound of horses' hooves behind them. They all stopped, ready to fight, when they were reached by 30 Dunedain from the north with Elladan and Elrohir. Their arrival greatly pleased Aragorn, because now he could count on his companions, relatives and friends, almost as tough and skilled in battle as himself. Together they returned to Helm's Deep, where Aragorn decided to use the Palantir, subjected it to his will and revealed itself to Sauron, dealing him a hard blow, since until then Sauron had been unaware of its existence. But now he feared that the Heir of Isildur could claim the throne of Gondor also with the Palantir subdued. Aragorn saw a large fleet of corsairs from Umbar attacking from the south, which would reduce the forces of Gondor, and like Elladan and Elrohir, they had brought a message from Elrond, which urged him to seek the path of the dead. Aragorn decided to do so. Therefore, leaving King Theoden, Éomer and Merry behind, Aragorn set out with Legolas, Gimli and the Grey Company to Edoras, where they were received by Éowyn, who first asked him not to go along the path, and when she saw that he would not be convinced otherwise, he asked him to allow him to go with them, but Aragorn refused. They set out again. After resting, they travelled to the sanctum, crossed the path of the dead, reached the Stone of Eric on the other side, where Aragorn summoned the dead, and promised them that if they helped him against the corsairs, he would free them from his curse. From there, they rode an exhausting journey to Pelargir, where the dead defeated the corsairs and Aragorn freed them, and thanks to Angbor of Lamadon, word spread of the arrival of Isildur's heir. So when Aragorn freed the prisoners and the dead disappeared, many of the men of South Gondor came to see him and joined him, thus gathering a large army of faithful men in just one day. With them, they took the ships. From the docks, they went up the river and arrived in time to fight in the Pelennor fields, where they broke into the middle of Sauron's armies, and Aragorn was reunited with Éomer in the centre of the battle. After conquering the countryside, Aragorn did not want to enter Minas Tirith, because doing so, without being summoned, he feared that controversies and doubts could arise that had to be avoided. While the war lasted, therefore, he decided not to enter or claim his right until it was known who would win, them or Sauron. However, Gandalf asked him to heal Faramir, Merry and Éowyn, and using the Athelas and the skill acquired throughout his life, Aragorn entered the city with the green stone of Galadriel as his only emblem, and healed the three of them. When he finished and he left the healing houses, a large crowd was waiting for him, because the word of the king's arrival had spread, and after dinner they begged him to heal their relatives or friends, whose lives were in danger because of the wounds of the battle or the black breath produced by the Nazgul. So Aragorn sent for Elladan and Elrohir, and the three together worked busily until late into the night, and since he did not tell anyone his true name, they began to call him Elessar Elfstone because of the green stone he carried, so that the name that was predestined for him on the day of his birth, he then chose for himself, his own people. The next day, Aragorn called Prince Imrahil and the new King Éomer to his tent, where they deliberated with Gandalf, Elladan and Elrohir. The wizard urged them to throw caution to the wind and attack Mordor, thus emptying the land, keeping the eye of Sauron fixed on them, and helping Frodo and Sam have a clear path to Mount Doom. Aragorn advised to listen to Gandalf, without whose help Sauron would have defeated them all a long time ago, and Imrahil and Éomer wanted to obey Aragorn, so they all agreed to go together to the Black Gate, and so they did. They left. Of Minas Tirith, with an army of 7,000 men that disintegrated along the way until they reached the Black Gate, only the bravest, pretending that one of them had the only ring and challenged Sauron for the dominion of Middle-earth, as a bait that had to be sacrificed so that Frodo and Sam could complete their mission. When the Black Gate opened, they spoke with the emissary, the mouth of Sauron, who showed them Frodo's mail, Sam's sword, and an elven cloak, leaving them all hopeless and making them believe that the hobbits were dead. But still Gandalf rejected his conditions. Aragorn arranged his men as best he could on the two rock hills in front of the gate, and the battle began. A battle that, fortunately, did not last long, because at the same time that they were fighting, Gollum fell with the only ring inside Mount Doom, killing the first and destroying the second, thus destroying Sauron's power. Dissipus and his creatures fled in terror. Gandalf saved Frodo and Sam from the lava with the great eagles, and they all met again in the fields of Cormallen, where Aragorn healed them both and a great feast took place. Then they went to Minas Tirith, where Faramir handed over the government to him, of the kingdom to Aragorn, who was crowned as Elessar Telcontar, king simultaneously of Gondor and Arnor, and began numerous works for the prosperity of Middle-earth, made peace with Harad. gave freedom to the men of the East, granted the region near the sea of He nourished the prisoners of Mordor and spared Beregond from the guard, among many other things. During the first weeks, he was waiting for a sign, which came when Gandalf guided him to a seed from the White Tree, which King Elessar planted in the citadel, replacing the previous dead tree, and after finding that sign, he called for Arwen, his beloved, who arrived in Minas Tirith with his father, his grandparents, and a glorious escort, and thus both were able to finally get married on the day of the summer solstice of the year 3019 of the Third Age, when King Elessar was 88 years old and the Queen Arwen with 2,778. A month after the wedding, an escort from Rohan arrived to take the body of King Theoden. Along the way, King Elessar proclaimed that he was giving the Dunedain forest to the people of Ganbarigan, already in Edoras. They buried the old king along with Yorl's descendants. After the funeral, Faramir became engaged to Éowyn, and Elessar was finally calm when he saw that that young woman had found another man other than him. From Edoras, the procession continued first to Helm's Deep, and then to Fangorn, where King Elessar gave the valley of Orthanc to the Ents, then descended the fords of Isen and said goodbye to his friends to return to Gondor. He would never see Frodo, Elrond, Galadriel, Gandalf again in life, but he would see the others, because of course King Elessar remained in contact with all the friends he had made during the last 2 years. Faramir was his seneschal, and he lived with Éowyn in Emin Arnen. Imrahil remained Prince of Dol Amroth, and his daughter also married King Éomer of Rohan. Gimli brought part of the people of Erebor from the north and carried out great works in Gondor and Rohan, among which were forging new gates of mithril and steel for Minas Tirith, and Legolas also took the Wood Elves to the south and settled in Ithilien, which once again became the most beautiful country in the Western lands. We barely have data on the reign of Elessar and Arwen because it was peaceful and prosperous, but we know that they had a son, Eldarion, and an indeterminate number of daughters. In Gondor, they lived in Minas Tirith, but when they travelled to Arnor, they lived in Anuminas in year 6 of the Fourth Age. King Elessar promulgated an edict according to which men could not enter the region, making it a free land under the protection of the centre of the north. 7 years later, he made the Tain, the Lord of the Garmos, and the Mayor of the Shire, advisors of Arnor. In the year 15, he met Sam, Merry, and Pippin at Brandywine Bridge. He gave the Star of the Dunedain to Sam, and his daughter Eleanor was appointed as Queen Arwen's Maid of Honour in the year 31, a gift to the region of the western frontier, from distant ravines to Emin Baraid. We know that King Elessar reigned over all the old borders of Arnor and Gondor except in Rohan, for King Éomer and he renewed the oath of Sirion and Eorel, which they kept frequently, for although Sauron had already disappeared, the hatreds and the evils they sowed had not died, and Elessar, King of the West, had many enemies to subdue before the White Tree could rest in peace. Wherever King Elessar went with his wars, King Éomer went with him to the edge of the Sea of Run in the distant fields of the south. However, they were mortal men, and in the 62nd year of the Fourth Age, King Éomer died in Edoras. The hobbits Meriadoc and Peregrine had tied up all the affairs of the Shire. They were with him, so after his death, they went to Minas Tirith, where they spent their last remaining years until they died, and were laid to rest in Ruth Dinas, among the great ones of Gondor. Likewise, 20 years later, Faramir, Seneschal, King and Prince of Emin Arnen, died, and 38 years later, King Elessar's time came. Queen Arwen had lived at his side during those 120 years of glory and fortune. But when King Elessar felt that old age was approaching and knew that those days of his long life were ending, he wanted to say goodbye to her. The queen could not stand it, because the pain overwhelmed her, but he lay down on the long bed that had been prepared for him. He said goodbye to Eldarion. He placed in his hands the winged crown of Gondor and the centre of Arnor. Then everyone retired except the queen, and despite her great wisdom and her own lineage, she could not help but beg him to stay for some time, because she was not yet tired of the days, and now feeling the bitter taste of the mortality that she herself had chosen, Elessar asked her to reflect. If he really wanted him to cling to life and end up being a decrepit old man, he reasoned that he had had a life 3 times longer than that of the men of Middle-earth, and the grace of voluntarily abandoning it, and that he had to restore that gift. For it was the elven vision, and that of the uncorrupted Númenóreans, that good men must die voluntarily, surrendering before being forced before old age and weakness consumed them. So Elessar reminded her that she could still go to Valinor if she wanted to. But Arwen refused, saying that that decision had been made a long time ago, and that she now understood the bitterness in the mortality of men. Finally, he let him go, and Elessar fell asleep, and a great beauty was revealed in him. A beauty that all those who later went to see him contemplated in wonder, because in him they saw united the grace of youth and the courage of maturity and wisdom and the majesty of old age. And there it lay long, an image of the splendor of the kings of men in the radiant glory before the world was torn apart. Aragorn died on March 1st, 120 of the Fourth Age, at the age of 210. It is said that the beds of Meriadoc and Peregrine were placed on the sides of the great king's bed, and Legolas built a grey ship in Ithilien, which he used with Gimli to sail down the Anduin to the sea and head to Valinor. And when that ship sailed, the company of the Ring in Middle-earth came to an end. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe, like, and see you next time.